On a spring morning in 1838, a young man named Stephen Bishop stood at the edge of a drop in the Kentucky limestone that no lantern could find the bottom of. He was 17, maybe 18. He was enslaved, the legal property of a lawyer named Franklin Gorin, who had purchased the cave above him only months earlier and needed someone to guide paying visitors through its first mile of passage. Bishop was not given a compass. He was not given a chain, a transit, or any instrument that a trained surveyor of his era would have considered necessary to measure unmapped ground. He had a lantern, a cedar pole, and a willingness to walk into a hole in the earth that the men who owned him would not enter. He laid the pole across the gap, tested his weight against it, and crossed. On the other side was a passage no European or American visitor had ever seen. He named it as he walked it. He kept walking. Within 4 years, he had covered ground that would take institutional science more than a century to formally acknowledge existed, in a system whose full extent the federal government still cannot commit to a final number for. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Bishop crossed that morning is known today as the Bottomless Pit, a vertical shaft roughly 105 feet deep, cutting through a passage in what would become Mammoth Cave. It is not bottomless. It has a floor, reached decades later by better rope and better light. But in 1838, it functioned as a hard stop, the edge of the known world for every guide and every visitor who had come before him. Beyond it, the limestone opens into corridors that run for miles in directions no map of the region accounted for. Wide, dry avenues with ceilings 40 and 50 feet overhead, narrow crawls barely wider than a man's shoulders, and rivers running in total darkness far beneath the Kentucky farmland above. The passages are carved from St. Louis and Gherkin limestone, laid down when this part of the continent sat under a shallow sea roughly 340 million years ago, and hollowed since by water finding every fracture the rock would give it. What Bishop found was not a single tunnel. It was a network, branching and rejoining, extending in directions that even now are not fully accounted for on any single published survey. The people who followed Bishop into that darkness left records, and the records agree with each other in ways that are hard to dismiss. A geologist visiting in the 1840s described the same wide level floor in Cleveland Avenue that a physician's journal from the same decade described independently, down to the pale gypsum flowers crusting the walls. Visitors described Echo River, running silent and black, nearly 360 feet below the surface entrance, home to eyeless fish that no one on the surface had catalogued before Bishop guided naturalists down to net them. Multiple accounts, written by people who never read each other's notes, describe walking for what felt like hours without reaching a wall. The agreement is not proof of anything supernatural. It is proof that what lay beyond the bottomless pit was real, physically consistent, and larger than the 19th century's maps of Edmonson County had any framework for. By local account, the ground Bishop personally walked, named, and carried back to the surface in his own memory, eventually totaled something close to 40 miles of passage, a figure passed down through the guide service's own internal reckoning, rather than through any state survey of the period. He did this without a chain or a transit because none was given to him. What he used instead was pace count, memory, and an eye trained by walking the same ground over and over until its proportions became instinct. In 1842, at the request of a visiting scientist, Bishop sat down and produced a map of what he had explored. He drew it from memory alone. When later surveyors compared it against instrument-based measurements taken decades afterward, the proportions held. Corridors that Bishop had placed at certain distances and angles from each other, using nothing but recollection and pacing, were confirmed to within a margin that professional surveyors of his own time would not have been ashamed to sign their names to. The map circulated. Engraved versions were printed and sold to visitors for years afterward, and geologists cited it as the standard reference for the cave's interior long after Bishop himself was dead. Franklin Gorin sold the cave, and Bishop along with it, to a physician named John Croghan in 1839. Croghan expanded the tourist operation, brought in patients hoping the cave's still air might treat tuberculosis, and kept Bishop on as his principal guide. When Croghan died in 1849, his will provided that his enslaved guides, Bishop included, would eventually be freed. Bishop lived to see that freedom for less than a year. He died in 1857, likely in his mid to late 30s, and was buried in what is now called the Old Guides Cemetery, inside the boundary of the cave he had spent nearly 2 decades measuring with his own footsteps. His grave is a short walk from an entrance he mapped before the state of Kentucky had a formal geological survey of its own. For most of the century that followed, the published record did not center Bishop's name the way the exploration record did. Guidebooks, estate correspondence, and early tourist literature more often credited the cave's owners or referred generically to the guides than named the man whose pacing and memory had produced the map every one of them was working from. Visitor journals from the 1840s name him directly, describe his conversation, his knowledge of side passages other guides would not risk, his correction of visiting scientists on points of cave geography. The published estate literature of the following decades is thinner on his name than the private accounts are. That is not proof of a plot. It is what the record shows, and what the record does not say is itself part of what the record shows. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The cave did not stop growing after Bishop died. It kept being mapped, slowly, by people working without institutional support for most of the 20th century. A non-profit group of volunteer surveyors calling itself the Cave Research Foundation formed in 1957, made up largely of amateur cavers with day jobs in unrelated fields, who spent weekends underground with tape measures and compasses doing the work no state agency had funded. For 15 years they worked 2 separate systems, the passages under Mammoth Cave itself, and a separate, equally vast network 6 miles northeast called the Flint Ridge Cave System, which cavers had been mapping since the 1950s without knowing whether the 2 systems connected underground at all. On September 9, 1972, a team led by cavers Richard Zopf, Patricia Crowther, Gary Eller, Cleveland Pinnix, and Stephen Wells found the link. After a crawl through a passage barely large enough to move through, following a lead that had been dismissed by earlier survey teams as unpromising, they emerged into a chamber they recognized from Mammoth Cave's own survey. The 2 systems were one system. The connection instantly made the combined cave the longest known cave system on the planet, a title it still holds. What had been treated for over a century as 2 separate caves under 2 separate landowners turned out to be a single continuous network the whole time, its true extent hidden not by any agency's decision, but by the simple fact that no one had walked far enough, in the right direction, to find the seam. The pattern repeats elsewhere, and it is worth naming plainly rather than treating as coincidence. At Lechuguilla Cave in New Mexico, a passage long dismissed as a minor blown-out pit beneath a small tourist attraction was reopened by amateur cavers in 1986 after decades of institutional indifference, and within a few years of digging through rubble by hand, they broke into a system that has since been surveyed past 140 miles, containing mineral formations found almost nowhere else on Earth. In both Kentucky and New Mexico, the actual extent of what lay underground was established not by the federal agencies that eventually took credit for managing the sites, but by unpaid, unaffiliated individuals willing to keep crawling past the point where official surveys had stopped looking. The National Park Service manages Mammoth Cave today. It did not discover Mammoth Cave's true scale, and it did not employ the people who did. What is consistent across these 2 systems is not a cover-up in the sense of a locked filing cabinet somewhere. It is a pattern of institutional lag, the gap between what the ground actually contains and what the agencies responsible for that ground are willing to certify as known. Mammoth Cave National Park's own published trail materials, even now, describe the system's length with a qualifier attached, more than 400 miles surveyed, with the explicit acknowledgement that new passage is still being found most years. No agency has ever issued a final figure for the Mammoth Cave system's total length, because doing so would require claiming an ending that the cave itself has not shown anyone. The absence of a final number is not evasion. It is honesty about the limits of what pacing, tape measures, and volunteer weekends can cover in a network that has been growing on paper for 170 years without growing an inch in the rock itself. What survives from Bishop's era is not just the passages, though those are still walked today by park rangers leading the same routes he first found. His 1842 map survives as well, reproduced in period engravings held in university and state archive collections, its proportions still cited by cave historians as a benchmark for what an untrained, unequipped observer accomplished using nothing but memory and repetition. The guest ledgers that name him directly survive in scattered archives across Kentucky and beyond, offering a version of the record more generous than the published guidebooks of his own century were willing to be. And the cave keeps offering up more of itself. New connections have been surveyed within the last 2 decades, passages linking previously separate sections of the known system, confirming that even a network approaching 500 miles has not yet shown investigators its edges. Stephen Bishop crossed a 100-foot drop on a cedar pole because no one had given him a reason to believe there was anything worth finding on the other side, and he went anyway. What he found was not a myth, and it was not an exaggeration. It was 40 miles of real ground beneath real Kentucky farmland, walked, named, and carried home in the memory of a man the record of his own time was reluctant to credit by name. The passages are still there, running under towns and fields that have no idea what continues beneath their foundations. The map he drew from memory still holds up against instruments he never had access to, and the agency now responsible for telling the public how large that system truly is still will not give a final number, because the man who first proved how far it went did the measuring with his feet, not with an instrument any institution ever gave him. Bishop did not walk that ground alone, and the record makes that difficult to ignore once you start looking for it. 2 other enslaved men, Mat and Nick Bransford, guided visitors through the same passages during the same decades, and their descendants kept guiding at Mammoth Cave for more than 100 years afterward, into the era of the National Park Service itself. The Bransford name appears on guide rosters from the 1830s through the 1930s, an unbroken family line, doing work that required the same memory, the same pacing, the same willingness to walk past the edge of the mapped world. Yet where Bishop's name eventually made it into geological literature because a visiting scientist happened to ask him to draw what he knew, the Bransford's contributions sit almost entirely in ledgers, payroll records, and the occasional visitor's diary entry, never assembled into a single account the way Bishop's was. The unevenness of what got written down is not an accident of history. It is a record shaped by who happened to be asked and who did not. The naturalists who came to study what the guides found were not exaggerating their interest. Mammoth Cave's rivers hold fish with no eyes and no pigment, evolved in total darkness over a span of time long enough to erase organs that had no use underground. The first scientific descriptions of these fish in the early 1840s depended entirely on specimens the guides netted from Echo River and carried back to the surface, through passages that no visiting scientist could have found alone. The published papers credit the species. They rarely credit the hands that caught it. That pattern, expert science built on unpaid or unfree labor and then presented to the public with the labor stripped out of the account, repeats through nearly every decade of the cave's early history, and it is visible now only because enough scattered fragments of the underlying record survive to be cross-checked against each other more than a century later. What happened above ground in the early 1900s complicates the story further. As Mammoth Cave's fame grew, rival landowners in the same limestone belt began opening their own show caves nearby and competing for the same tourist traffic arriving by train and later by automobile. Locals came to call the resulting decades the Kentucky Cave Wars. Cave operators hired men to stand along the roads and steer travelers toward the wrong entrance, told visitors that Mammoth Cave was closed or flooded when it was not, and in at least one documented case dug a connecting tunnel toward a competitor's cave to divert its underground river and drain its main attraction. Signs were altered. Hawkers lied outright about which cave they represented. The competition became fierce enough, and the deception common enough, that it became one of the arguments used to justify consolidating the region's private caves under a single federal authority. Mammoth Cave National Park was established in 1941, absorbing dozens of small competing operations, including many of the same passages Bishop and the Bransfords had walked a century earlier under private ownership. Not every underground venture in the region ended in consolidation. In 1897, and again more famously in 1925, a cave explorer named Floyd Collins became trapped while searching nearby Sand Cave for a passage he hoped would rival Mammoth Cave's fame and draw paying visitors to his family's land. He was pinned by a fallen rock roughly 150 feet inside the entrance. What followed became one of the first major American media events of the 20th century. Newspapers wired daily updates nationwide. Crowds gathered outside the cave entrance, vendors sold food to the onlookers, and a reporter who crawled in to interview Collins directly won a Pulitzer Prize for the coverage. Collins died underground after 18 days, before rescuers could reach him, and the failure of every official rescue effort attempted became its own kind of public reckoning with how little authority anyone actually had over ground that ran this deep and this far from any surveyed map. His body was later moved to Mammoth Cave itself, then eventually reburied at a family cemetery, a final resting place still argued over by his descendants. The survey work did not stop with the 1972 connection between Flint Ridge and Mammoth Cave. In 1983, cavers confirmed a further connection to a system called Roppel Cave, discovered only a decade earlier, a few miles to the east, adding a substantial new stretch of passage to what was already the longest known cave system on Earth, and forcing yet another upward revision of the total. Every decade since has produced smaller versions of the same story. A crawl someone had judged too tight to bother with turns out to open into Virgin Passage, and the number on the park's own signage quietly climbs again. The Cave Research Foundation, still volunteer-run, still made up largely of people with unrelated day jobs who spend their weekends underground with survey tape, continues logging new mileage most years. No single agency has ever been positioned to declare the count finished, because the count has never actually stopped moving, and the ground beneath Kentucky farmland has shown no sign, after nearly 2 centuries of measurement, of running out of places still left to be walked for the first time. International recognition came to the cave twice more before the century closed. In 1981, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization named Mammoth Cave a World Heritage Site, placing it on a list alongside the Pyramids of Giza and the Great Barrier Reef. 9 years later, in 1990, the same site was designated an International Biosphere Reserve, a recognition reserved for landscapes considered scientifically significant enough to study as a single living system rather than a static attraction. Both designations came from bodies with no authority to survey a single foot of the passages themselves. They recognized what was already known to be extraordinary, without adding a single new mile to the map. The threat that followed arrived without warning and without a name anyone in Kentucky had used before. A fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, responsible for a condition known as white nose syndrome, was first documented in New York in 2006 and spread south and west through bat hibernation sites over the following decade, killing colonies by the million wherever it reached them. When it was confirmed inside the Mammoth Cave system, the National Park Service closed sections of the cave to visitors entirely, not to protect people from the cave, but to protect the cave's own bat populations from being carried the fungus on human boots and clothing. It is a strange inversion for a place defined for 2 centuries by the question of what lay past the edge of the known passage. For the first time, the danger being managed was not what might be found in the dark. It was what visitors themselves might be bringing into it, one pair of boots at a time, without ever knowing they carried it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.